Hi, I'm Lance. Welcome to Fill the Boot, a channel with tips and advice for early stage founders and interviews with influential entrepreneurs. I've been thinking a lot about a certain kind of advice that I see on the internet really frequently, where often in an interview with a very successful entrepreneur or founder, or in other kinds of advice where they're laying out a very set program for achieving success. They'll say, here's this template, or here's this recipe that you can follow in order to be successful. And that always makes me a little bit uncomfortable because startups aren't like snowflakes. They're far more unique than snowflakes. And the advice that'll work for one may not work for another. And my concern is that these kind of tips can lead to cargo cult thinking. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what cargo cult thinking is, how that applies to the startup environment, and how you can change the way you think about the advice to make it more effective for you in the long run. So cargo cults are something that have been around for centuries, and it's something I really like to talk about because I think it's such a fascinating phenomena. But it really came to prominence, and I think the strongest examples come from World War II. Cargo cults happened when a much more technologically advanced civilization interfaces with one that's much less developed, but also has very little experience of contact with more technological groups. And in World War II, this happened in the Pacific Islands, where the military, Air Force, Navy would move in and set up shop on some tiny remote island that had had almost no contact previously, and immediately start building airports and control towers and docks and having military parades and having tons and tons of supplies, food, jeeps, uniforms, weapons, all delivered to this tiny island. Many of these supplies were shared with the local population, in part to get their goodwill. And then after a few years, when the war ended, everyone left, right? They all departed, they abandoned these air bases, and the people on these islands were left to wonder, what happened here? How is it that these people were able to get this amazing bounty of supplies, all this cargo delivered to our island, but the gods wouldn't do it for us? And they thought, well, maybe it's the things they were doing. So they'd try to reproduce what they saw in an attempt to get the cargo. So they'd have parades. They'd march up and down in their homemade uniforms with sticks carved to look like guns. They'd make wooden replicas of airplanes or control towers, clear clearings for airstrips. Anything that they thought they remembered the soldiers doing, they try to do themselves in hope that that would then allow them to get the same cargo that the Americans and the Japanese were getting. Now, of course, this was not effective. In fact, this did not bring back airplanes dropping canned goods out of the sky. And the reason is they didn't understand what was actually going on. They saw the forms, but failed to understand the purpose through no fault of their own. Right? These were reasonable conclusions to draw. But the reason that the air traffic control tower was important is because that's how you vector in the airplanes. Right? We understand that intuitively. But they were just trying to say, what could we see? What did we observe that we can try to imitate? And I think the problem is that same thing can happen to founders. So often you'll be hearing an interview with someone who's had a massively successful startup, and they'll be telling you about the things they did. They say, okay, so we had this clever idea, and we did this kind of marketing, and we advertised in this place, and we set up the following kinds of partnerships and channel arrangements, and we were able to get people to engage in synergistic effects and get network effects to build things up and get virality going with our solution. And those are all great. They may or may not have been the things that in fact caused the company to be successful. I think there's a lot of self-delusion about which elements of the story you tell actually were the ones that mattered and which ones just happened to be things you did that might or might not have made much difference if you'd done them slightly differently. But the important thing is they're all incredibly specific to this company and its time and place in the world. And so that might not work at all later. His advice about how to advertise or which markets to go after or what channels to use probably were an insight that he had at that time, which were specific to the fact that these were underutilized channels. And he had this insight that, I can get a really good deal here. Well, if this is a very successful company that's been out there for a while, many other people have learned this lesson too, and those channels probably aren't at all as advantageous as they were originally. And so the greenfields are going to be somewhere else. And if you just imitate what he did, you're going to fall into a really expensive and painful quagmire. Another example that I see quite frequently is pitch deck templates, where someone's created what they think of as the perfect pitch deck, and it's got the problem, the solution, the team, it's got a slide for each one of the important things that everyone tells you need to have, and the slides are pretty, right? They've got nice backgrounds, good color schemes, appropriate selections of fonts, and the idea is that you can just drop your company name in, replace the template problem with your problem, your solution with their solution, right? Just step by step by step. It's really straightforward. It doesn't require a lot of thought. It's a really easy way to get a good looking deck. But if you've heard my other episodes talking about decks, you know that I'm always ranting about how important it is to emphasize the things that are special about your company. Where are your strengths? What are the advantages you have? What are the special insights that you have into this market that are going to allow you to be successful where some other company who is a competitor isn't going to be? And the template isn't going to help you with that. It's much more of a paint by numbers solution, and you need to understand how things work. It is around that understanding that I'm going to put in the boot, because I think these kinds of pieces of advice are so appealing and so popular because they're easy. They don't require that you think very hard. And we all know that thinking is kind of painful. When I sit down and I have to think about a new episode, there's often this repulsion. I need to really engage the little gray cells and grind hard. But that's precisely what's required for a founder all the time, particularly in these kind of situations. When you're thinking about how do I pitch the company, or you're thinking about what is my business model, or what's my go-to-market strategy. So what you can do is you can look at some of this advice or these other examples as models, and models are only useful within a certain context. Now, as I've talked about before, my background was originally in astrophysics, so I'll go to that as an example model. We usually use the heliocentric model. You have a sun in the middle, and you have all the planets going around that star, and that model works pretty well for most purposes, right? Around here, if I want to send a probe to Mars, then it's probably going to get there because that's the correct model. That gives the predictions that allow me to know, the planet's going to be in this spot at that time, send the rocket in that direction, and it'll get there. But this is not a universally useful model. For example, if I happen to live in a binary star system, this would be a terrible model to use. It doesn't describe at all what's going on in that system. So there I need to have a model made up of two stars, and maybe one star has the planets going around it and the other star is orbiting it in a distant orbit. Maybe there's planets around both. Maybe the two stars are close together and all the planets orbit them both, right? There's all kinds of scenarios that could be going on. You need to understand what is your situation before you can see which model will be useful. And I think useful is the way to look at it. When you talk to scientists, they rarely talk about models or theories being right or wrong. The question is it useful? Does it have insights and predictive powers that apply to your business that you can use to have some more effective outcome? So really, my advice here is start with first principles. Think about your business first. Understand what your situation, your market, your customers, your core strategies, your competitive advantages, your unfair advantages, your secret sauce. Get your head around all of those things. Then you can start looking at these pieces of advice as models and saying, which one of these seem to match my situation the best? And then you can use that to start adapting their strategies, their approaches into your business model, into your strategy, into your deck, where they're effective. Right? If someone else has made an argument almost exactly just like yours in their pitch deck, that might be something you want to steal. But you still probably don't want to steal their entire pitch deck because other elements of what they're doing won't be a good match. But learning from others is great. Right? You don't want to repeat everyone else's mistakes, and it's unlikely that you'll be able to navel gaze your way to all the great ideas that anyone else has ever had. But they're never a recipe, right? A recipe tells you follow step A, B, C, D, and get an outcome. And that works in cooking because we almost all have the same supplies. I've got the same kind of spices, I've got the same kind of bowl, the same utensils, the same measuring instruments. But if I didn't, if I was cooking everything in a clay pot instead of a stainless steel pan on a normal burner, then those recipes would be ridiculous. Now, if you look at the way they train a chef, they teach them to understand why these things work. And so a recipe for them tends to be a framework like, hey, it turns out that there's this kind of flavor palette that's really good. And if you approach it in this way with these kind of techniques, it produces this really yummy outcome. And then you can look at what you have, which ingredients you have, what kind of tools, what kind of cooking apparatus, and you can then get a very successful result for exactly the outcome that you desire because you understand why it works and you're not just following the recipe slavishly. It's why bad cooks have such a problem when there's a typo in a cookbook. They will do the thing that that cookbook says, even if it makes no sense and leads to a total disaster. So in a nutshell, be skeptical of the advice you see, particularly anytime it's framed in terms of being a universal piece of advice for any startup. There really is no such thing. You're all incredibly unique with different goals, different business models, different planned outcomes, right? Some of you are going to be bootstrapping. Some of you are going to be trying to get venture capital and go for the moon. Some of you are consumers, some of you are B2B, right? It's endless numbers of approaches to all of this. But most of these pieces of advice do contain nuggets of truth that might be useful and could be worth mining. So that's my advice. Look closely and skeptically at the recipe, but see if there's principles that you can extract. Thanks for watching this episode. I hope you found it useful and interesting. And if you did, please do me a favor. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. It makes a huge difference to the channel. It tells the algorithm that this is the kind of information that other entrepreneurs find useful, and it helps us reach more founders that way. And that is, after all, the whole point of why I'm doing this. I also invite you to come over to feeltheboot.com and subscribe to our mailing list where you get member-exclusive content as well as member-only office hours if you want to get the boot one-on-one. You can also join our community of other founders at the Facebook Feel the Boot Founders Alliance. Say that 3 times fast. And I'll put a link to that down in the description. Till next time, ciao.